All right, I'm now here with Rachel Cohen. She is a senior policy reporter over at Vox and the author of a recent article titled How State Governments Are Reimagining American Public Housing. Rachel, good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you for having me.
So let's dive into your article. You reported on a couple of pretty interesting sort of public housing experiments that are unfolding at the state and local level in the US right now. Before we get to the specifics of those, though, I want to ask you about kind of the situation of housing in general. So obviously, we are in the midst of an ongoing housing crisis. Maybe talk a little bit about what you see as driving that crisis and then how you think city and state governments have responded thus far.
Yeah, so the housing crisis, which has been building for decades, I'd say it's kind of broken into two things. One, there are not enough homes for people to live in. The population is growing. People want to move to certain cities, certain areas. There's not enough places to live. And then the second related problem, but not entirely related, is that of the houses that do exist, they're too expensive for people to afford. And wages aren't going up. This was a problem before inflation. So there's both not enough houses for homes for people to rent or buy who want to, and the people who currently have homes are getting priced out. They can't afford to stay, and if they get priced out, they can't find anywhere to go. So this is a major problem. I think it was maybe easier for people to ignore back when they thought it was just a San Francisco thing or maybe just a New York City thing. But this is a problem we're seeing all over nationwide. Suburbs, rural, even, rural areas have a problem with housing too. So that is, that's a simplified, but broad strokes. When people are talking about the housing crisis, they're like, I can't afford housing. It is the biggest sort of part of people's budget monthly. Mm-hmm. And I guess, how states and local governments were responding up to this point, there are kind of housing is very sort of complicated. It's complicated in the sense of, and it runs into all these politics about, people. We tell people to get a house to raise generational wealth, and then if you build more houses around that could, affect how much appreciation that house might one day get. So then people fight it, and there's obviously, as I'm sure listeners to this know, just decades of people opposing new housing construction for all sorts of not in my backyard NIMBY reasons. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of just over time, more and more, opposition to that getting built. And, very specifically, opposition, so much opposition to low-income housing being built, affordable housing for people who, there's opposition to low-income housing, but there's also opposition to higher-income housing too, mm-hmm. depending on the area. And I think it's sort of just these problems mounted on top of each other over so many years, and now we are in a really big crisis.
Right. So let's now turn to public housing. I think this is really interesting because obviously public housing in the US, to say the least, has gotten a bad rap, right? We're used to thinking of these kind of huge, monstrous, ugly buildings, the projects, so to speak, that are in disrepair and, are very heavily stigmatized. And what's interesting about some of the new public housing projects that you've been reporting on is that it seems like some cities are now actually experimenting with investing in what we might call more European style social housing, right? So maybe talk a little bit now about what some of those programs look like. What are these cities doing?
Yeah. And, I think it's really worth just noting, there's no reason that American public housing has to there is a reason now, but in theory, the reason that American public housing has this terrible reputation and we have all the stigma is largely because of rules that Congress passed that has crippled the way that we can build it and the kinds of construction materials that could be used, the composition of tenants. There were sort of rules about sort of slum clearance to new units. And part of the reason that, public housing, social housing in other countries looks different is because they're not, restricted in the way that Congress has restricted federal public housing. So what's kind of exciting about this state and local public housing is they are able to build rules outside of the rules governing the federal program. And the federal program has basically been the only player in town for, almost 100 years. And so I think it's like, if you look at sort of one of the places I talk about in my story is Montgomery County, Maryland. And I was looking through kind of some of the renderings of the projects that they have under construction, and like, I would definitely live in them. They look really nice. They're next to, transit stations. They have like indoor, facilities and really nice units. And I think, if we think about public schools, like there's huge variation in the quality of a facility of a public school depending on, the community. I mean, like, I sort of go back and forth. I think the social housing thing is an interesting question, because on the one hand, advocates for social housing say like it in the US because it can help differentiate it from this more stigmatized American style public housing, which is sort of lower quality, often seen as unsafe or dirty or segregated or income restricted. And social housing can signal this like nicer quality, mixed income, like more aesthetically pleasing building. But sometimes I worry we're like ceding too much about, because it is still public housing. It would still be publicly owned. And
right.
I don't have like strong, I'm not like, I don't have strong feelings. Like if it's the thing that's most likely going to get it done, sure, call it social housing. But, I think it is a really sort of an example of the public sector sort of stepping up and like
right.
flexing its muscles in a good way.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I want to stay on that question because as you had alluded to, housing in the US historically has sort of been the purview of the federal government. And it's now really interesting that you see these states and cities sort of stepping up to fund these types of projects, right? So how did this come about? And do you think this is a sustainable model?
So, and I guess just on that quick point, so the federal government actually only started getting involved in housing. There was sort of pressure building up in the 1920s, and then the New Deal and sort of going on from the New Deal is when they stepped up. And that kind of HUD was created, the Federal Department of Housing was created in the 1960s. And the federal low-income housing tax credit, which is sort of now the biggest program to fund affordable housing, was in the 1980s. So this was like, they stepped up and then everyone kind of retreated back. But there's no reason other than like, I mean, there are reasons that they might have wanted to step back, but they can certainly step up even though they have retreated over the last century.
Right.
And so I think there's some things about this model that is really interesting. I went into the reporting thinking like, okay, I've read, including at Jacobin, like I've been familiar with the Red Vienna model for a long time. It sounds amazing. I would read about it and be like, oh, but it will never work here. Like, there's so many reasons why that won't work here because there's so many things that don't seem like we can just bring it over. And what was really interesting to me was sort of how I think these states and local governments are figuring out how to make it work, even in the context of this country with our sort of like strong values of home ownership, whatever, and our less generous welfare states. Like, they are finding models that, to this point, when we've constructed affordable housing, it's basically been just throwing massive amounts of subsidies at a project and making, and then, and so there's like, which again, I don't think we should stop doing, but there's sort of been reasons why governments have felt like more conflicted about it. With this model, they're finding, we can like actually put a little bit of money and then sort of leverage that in ways, and then we would actually be reclaiming the value from this property that we can get from like higher income tenants to subsidize the lower income tenants over time, and then we're going to end up with a lot more money down the line than we even started with to build even more housing for more people. So I don't know if that's a very good explanation. That's sort of a very rough thing, but I think states are starting to recognize their own self-interest in this model. Like, we can actually house our residents. We can step up and do a better job of solving this homelessness crisis, this housing crisis, and end the suffering. And we can probably do it without basically giving all these money to Wall Street investors and real estate investors in Texas who come in and have typically kind of shouldered the construction and like reaped the profits of these deals, affordable housing deals.
Yeah. I mean, well, I actually wanted to end with a question on the private sector, because, you know, you don't get into this much in your piece, but I'm just wondering whether you see, you know, an expansion of public housing in the future, thanks to these, you know, new experiments. Or do you see the private sector, you know, private investors and the real estate industry kind of coming together to oppose that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there is, I mean, we don't really know yet how they will fight it. There are sort of examples where this could work, where like private developers still build the housing, but it's owned by the government. So like, you know, there's probably some private companies who still see a win-win for them. Like, okay, maybe I won't like reap the profits 20 years down the line, but I can like be hired to do a service now. The real estate industry is the not to like, sometimes there aren't bad villains. I think it's very like, I think in this case,
There's one.
Yeah. The real estate industry absolutely fought to weaken the original public housing bill in Congress and made it worse. And a lot of the reasons that public housing is so troubled today, I think really can be traced back to their lobbying. And continued lobbying over time. So I think it's a great question, something that we need to like kind of be watching how they respond. I haven't seen clear examples yet of what they're doing. They might not even have really realized it's happening either.
Right. To be continued.
Yeah.
All right. Rachel Cohen, again, is a policy reporter at Vox, and we will link her recent piece down below. Rachel, thanks so much for your time.
Yeah,
Great to see you.
Great to see you too. Thanks a lot.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.